From the moment my foot touched the rock, that eerie cold gnawing within me was no ordinary shiver. It was a frost rising from the island's millennia-old granite foundations, piercing the very depths of the soul. This isolated piece of land, surrounded by the choppy, leaden waters of the San Francisco Bay, felt like a living, breathing, ancient entity that had etched the ceaseless pains and unending angers of the past onto every moss-covered stone, every rusted iron bar. As the ferry made its way toward the island, the massive prison building, rising slowly like a phantom ship from the evening mists, seemed to carry the silent, endless wails of countless souls that had festered and been forgotten behind its bars. All those famous, blood-curdling stories everyone talked about, Al Capone's unsettling banjo sounds echoing from his empty cell at night, the indescribable, terrifying screams echoing through the pitch-dark corridors of D-Block, the last breaths of those who perished brutally in desperate escape attempts echoing from the island's rocks and their restless ghosts. I had always regarded them with detached curiosity as urban legends, exaggerated rumors, until that fateful night, until I stepped onto those stone walls among that cold iron into the unknown with my own 2 feet. As the tourist crowd departed on the last ferry back to the mainland, to the lights of civilization, the deep, suffocating silence that fell upon the island became even more unsettling, more palpable. I was one of a handful of curious visitors left behind for a special night tour, perhaps like me, unable to resist the pull of the unknown. The last crimson light of the setting sun stained the bay waters blood red, while the moonlight had already draped over the island like an eerie shroud, casting the shadows of the iron bars onto the cold, cracked concrete floors like skeletal fingers pointing accusingly. The guard's famous, now cliched phrase, "No escape from the island," buzzed in my ears like a threat. I felt it in every cell, every drop of my blood, that this wasn't just valid for the steel gates, the high walls, and the wild waters, but also for the unspeakable, soul-penetrating, oppressive gloom that permeated the island itself. As we stepped through the massive, foreboding gate of the main building, the air inside suddenly grew heavy as if an invisible hand was squeezing my throat. A sharp smell of rust, accumulated dampness from years, and an indefinable, palpable scent of despair filled my lungs. The corridors were dim, narrow, and twisted on as if endlessly. There were only our own footsteps and occasional sounds from afar that I couldn't quite place a high-pitched clang, as if metal scraped on metal, or a deep, muffled, painful hum from somewhere deep within. It felt as if we were lost in the internal organs of a massive, sleeping beast in its gloomy labyrinths. Our first stop was the reception area, where prisoners were brought when they first set foot on the island, where their last ties to the world were severed, and all their personal belongings, their scraps of hope, were taken. On the faded, yellowed photographs on the walls, there were the dull stares of men shackled to the island, each face bearing a strange, unreadable mixture of fear, defiance, and resignation to their fate. For a moment I felt that those gazes were alive, that their pupils moved, that they were following me, this stranger, this uninvited guest. A drop of cold sweat slowly, like a snake, trickled from my forehead to my temple, and then down the back of my neck. When we entered a block, it seemed slightly less terrifying than the other blocks, yet it held its own unique melancholy and unease. The cells here were referred to as Uptown and were given to prisoners in relatively better standing. But this didn't mean there was less suffering. As I passed one cell, I heard a faint, broken crying sound from inside, a heartfelt sob like a woman's. I paused, pressed my ear against the cold iron door. The sound stopped. Then it started again, this time closer, as if just beyond the door. But this was impossible. Alcatraz was a men's prison. Perhaps it was a trick of the wind, or the echoing lament of the ghost of a prisoner's wife or mother who had been imprisoned here for years. When I tried to adjust my eyes to the darkness inside for just an instant, I could swear I saw pale, thin fingers clutching the bars. As we moved between the cell blocks B and C, the atmosphere became even more oppressive, more suffocating. 3 tiers high, hundreds, thousands of cells stacked one upon the other, each so narrow that a man could barely stand or lie down. All empty, all pitch dark, all silent. Cold witnesses to untold, unspoken pains, unending angers, wasted years, and lost hopes. As I passed some cells, I seemed to hear unsettling, unintelligible whispers coming from inside, as if someone were trying to breathe their darkest, most horrifying secrets, their most painful regrets, into my ear. When I quickly turned my head to look, I was met only with the cold emptiness of the concrete and the swallowing darkness beyond the bars. Perhaps it was a trick of my tired mind, conjured by this gloomy atmosphere, or the unsettling sounds the wind made in the old rusty pipes, the broken glass. But these whispers, each time, were enough to freeze my blood. When we entered the shower rooms, I felt a sudden and sharp drop in temperature. Even though it was one of the warmest days of the season, it felt like an ice house inside. The cold seeping from the walls seemed to penetrate my bones. Water slowly dripping from the tiled, moss-covered walls was like tears that had never stopped for years. This was rumored to be a place where countless bloody fights and brutal stabbings occurred, where blood mixed with hot water and soap suds. For a moment, I saw a thin gray mist rise like a phantom from one of the empty shower heads, and then cut off immediately with an eerie silence, as if an invisible, disembodied person had just taken a long, hot shower here. Along with a strong smell of disinfectant and cheap soap, there was an indefinable, acrid, stale, metallic smell also present, a nauseating, penetrating scent resembling dried blood. When we moved to the Industries building, this was where prisoners once worked on tasks like laundry, shoe repair, or metalwork. Massive, silent machines stood like eerie silhouettes in the darkness. Suddenly, from a large press machine in the far corner, a creaking, rhythmic sound began, as if someone was trying to start it. The sound sped up, then cut off with a deafening clatter of metal on metal. In that moment, the story of the prisoner named Ruth Percival came to mind. According to legend, Percival had gone mad from monotony and despair in one of these workshops and chopped off his own fingers with an axe. That clatter, perhaps it was the sound of his axe or the falling of his severed fingers. From a corner of the workshop, a series of clangs came as if someone were dropping heavy metal tools. But there was no one else around but us, only the ghosts of the past, as if at their unfinished work. One of the most terrifying, most horrifying experiences began, without a doubt, as we approached D Block, known among prisoners as the Hole, the isolation cells. This was the darkest heart of Alcatraz. Torture chambers where the most vicious, most undisciplined, most desperate prisoners slowly lost their sanity, deprived entirely of daylight and human sound, where pitch darkness and absolute deafening silence reigned, where they were essentially buried alive. Even at the entrance to the corridor, the air was so heavy, so thick, that I struggled to breathe, to pull oxygen to my lungs. It felt as if an invisible weight was pressing on my chest. According to accounts, in the mid-1940s, a prisoner in one of these cells screamed non-stop throughout the night with a superhuman agony, terrifying the other prisoners. When morning came, the guards found him dead, his eyes wide as saucers with terror and pain, his mouth frozen in a final scream, and on his throat, deep, bruised, savage finger marks that he couldn't have made himself. The unspeakable, wordless terror of that prisoner's final moments seemed to seep from the cell's cold, damp, moss-covered walls and wrap around me like a spider web. In front of an empty isolation cell, I stood rooted to the spot. I couldn't bring myself to look through that tiny, rusty peephole in the door. Just then, from the pitch darkness inside the cell, I heard first a muffled, painful groan, and then that sickening, blood-curdling sound of fingernails desperately, frantically scraping against the concrete. I froze. I involuntarily took a step back, my heart fluttering like a bird threatening to break through my ribcage. The sound suddenly stopped, giving way to an even more terrifying silence. It must have been a trick of the wind, I tried to comfort myself once more. But that scraping sound was so real, so close. In that moment, in the dark, bottomless depths of the cell, for just an instant, I could swear I saw a distorted, human-like shadow slowly creeping towards the bars, something definitely not human. Its eyes, like two embers in the darkness, glowed with an unsettling light. I recoiled, nearly losing my balance and falling. Our guide came to my side anxiously, took my arm, but I couldn't utter a single word. My tongue was glued to the roof of my mouth. I forced myself to continue, to push what I had seen, heard, and felt out of my mind, to cling to logic. I had started to face a new fear around every corner, to see an indefinable threat in every shadow. When we reached the hospital ward, the area was slightly brighter than the other blocks, but the unsettling feeling, that bone-deep shiver, hadn't lessened even slightly. A rusted, abandoned wheelchair stood unsettlingly in the middle of the room, as if someone had just left it there. I looked around without taking my eyes off the wheelchair for a moment. In that instant, the chilling story of a prisoner known as the Butcher on the island in the 1930s, who was confirmed to be insane, came vividly to life in my mind. According to legend, the Butcher had one night brutally dismembered his cellmate for some unknown reason, and then, covered in blood, laughing hysterically with a surgeon's scalpel in hand, had wandered the hospital ward with the air of a victorious commander. Just as these horrifying thoughts were running through my mind, the wheelchair, as if pushed by an invisible, malevolent hand, began to rock slowly back and forth with an eerie creak. First lightly, then with a gradually accelerating, unnerving rhythm. Then, as if it had decided, it stopped abruptly. That rusty creak of the chair echoed in my ears inside my brain, like an echo of the Butcher's ominous, deranged laughter. There was a strong smell of antiseptic and chloroform in the air, but beneath it all, a stale, heavy scent of blood could also be detected, as if it had permeated the place for years. When we moved to the library section, the shelves were empty, but the air still held that distinct smell of old books and paper. For a moment, I saw a book fall from the top of a shelf as if pushed by an invisible hand. The dusty cover had opened. The pages rustled. When I bent down to look, it was an old book, written in a language I didn't understand. On one of its pages, there was a dried brown stain, just like an old bloodstain. One of the most terrifying moments occurred as we passed near the cell where Robert Stroud, famous as the Birdman, spent his long, lonely years. Stroud's deep, almost pathological obsession with birds and the strange, unintelligible bond he formed with them were known to everyone. As we passed his cell, I heard a very deep, faint bird chirping. This was impossible. Strict Alcatraz rules absolutely forbade birds on the island, especially within the cell blocks. The chirping repeated, this time clearer, closer, as if coming from that empty, dark cell right beside me. It felt like the helpless, panic-stricken fluttering of a tiny, invisible bird trapped inside. Or perhaps it was a reflection of the Birdman's restless soul. By the time we came to Al Capone's famous old cell in B Block, my hair was already standing on end. It was said that Capone stayed in a special cell to protect himself from other prisoners and potential attacks while in prison, and that he often tried to comfort himself by playing his banjo there, suppressing his loneliness and fears. Even after his death, many guards and some brave visitors had repeatedly claimed to have heard muffled, melancholic, soul-penetrating banjo sounds coming from that empty cell, especially late at night. I heard it too, at first very deep, as if seeping from the dark bottom of the sea, after decades of silence, accumulated pain. Then the sound slowly, eerily clarified. It was a completely out-of-tune, missing notes, sad yet equally disturbing, almost mocking, demonic melody. The notes hung in the air for a moment, seeping from the cell's cold, rusty iron bars and echoing in the gloomy, endless void of the corridor. The melody suddenly cut off with a high-pitched, ear-grating screech and was replaced by an icy, breathtaking whisper. A whisper right at the nape of my neck, where I felt its warm breath. You're here, and you're not going anywhere. Ever. Blood rushed to my head, and my knees gave out. I turned around and looked in terror, but the corridor was empty. There was only my own trembling shadow. The inside of the cell was pitch dark, as if the darkness itself had taken on a presence, watching me, waiting to pull me in. In the endless labyrinth of corridors, I felt completely lost now. Every shadow moved, came to life. Every sound felt like a threat, a warning. Every doorway seemed to open onto an unknown, unimaginable terror. I was drawn, as if like a puppet, against my will, towards C Block, where one of the bloodiest, longest, and most desperate escape attempts the island had ever seen, once known as the Battle of Alcatraz, had taken place. It was said that the ghosts of those who died in that 3-day hell, both guards and prisoners, still wandered those corridors, pursuing their unfinished business, their unending angers. Suddenly, from the wall right beside me, as if coming from inside the wall, first the sound of metal savagely grinding on metal, then a muffled, painful scream, immediately followed by the deafening, deadly blast of a handgun. It was as if that bloody, that desperate day, that very moment, was being replayed right there before my eyes. When I turned the corner, I saw a faint, dark, shiny stain on the floor where the moonlight hit. My heart pounding in my throat, I approached. As I held my light with trembling hands, I noticed the stain was fresh, shiny, and sticky, emitting an acrid, metallic smell. It was like warm blood that had just been spilled there, slowly starting to clot. I closed and opened my eyes in fear. In terror, the stain was gone. There was nothing but dusty concrete. Was I losing my mind? Or was this island truly replaying the darkest, bloodiest nightmares of the past, showing them to its visitors over and over? When we entered the spacious dining hall where the guards once ate and which is now said to be frequented by ghosts, I saw rusty metal trays sitting on the long wooden tables, as if they had just been left there. On one of them, there was a dried, unidentifiable, moldy food scrap. Suddenly, from one end of the table to the other, the unsettling, ear-grating, screeching sounds of hundreds of wooden chairs scraping against the concrete floor filled the entire hall, as if a crowd of invisible, hungry prisoners had simultaneously sat down and gotten up from their places. Then, as if hundreds, thousands of people were whispering simultaneously in different languages, an unintelligible, buzzing sound filled the room, an unsettling chorus resembling a ritual. Towards the exit, now almost staggering, moving forward with the last crumb of hope, I felt the unbearable, crushing weight of dozens, hundreds of invisible eyes fixed on me from every single cell, every dark corner, every broken window. It was as if the walls themselves were breathing. The island's curse was trying to suffocate me, to swallow me, to make me one of those forgotten souls. Finally, when I reached the main gate, that massive, cold iron door, my whole body was trembling with the hope of reaching freedom, life beyond that door. Without even looking back, I stumbled, breathless, throwing myself outside. When I got on the ferry, even as the island's ominous, dark silhouette slowly disappeared into the depths of the night, I continued to feel that icy, deathly whisper, that sad, cursed banjo sound. The unsettling gaze of those invisible, judging eyes, and that inexplicable, bone-deep, soul-originating cold still on me, on my skin, in my soul. I might have physically escaped Alcatraz, but I knew that a part of my soul, among those cold, damp, moss-covered stone walls, in those endless corridors, in those dark cells, would forever remain imprisoned with the ceaseless, painful whispers of the rotten, forgotten souls. The chilling, blood-curdling stories of that island were no longer mere legends, mere rumors for me. They were deep memories, etched into my being, that would bleed anew every time I remembered them. And that night, on that cursed island, I understood that some doors, once opened, no matter how hard you try, no matter how much you pray, would never fully close again. The island had called me, and I had answered its dark, unsettling call. Now, whether I wanted to or not, I was a part of it, carrying its curse,